Hi, this is Chapter 15, U.S. Compliance Laws, Part 1. So here are the topics for the chapter. I'll leave this here for a few seconds so you can read it. And here are chapter goals. The learning objective is to apply information security standards and U.S. compliance laws to real-world applications in both the private and public sector. The key concepts are what compliance is and how it's related to information security, overview of U.S. compliance laws, the NIST Risk Framework Management, or RMF, and making sense of laws for information security compliance. So first, let's talk about what compliance is and compliance laws. United States compliance laws. Organizations are entrusted with sensitive data, and these organizations should take steps to protect that data. The U.S. doesn't have one comprehensive data protection law. And many federal data protection laws focus on specific types of data. They require organizations to use security controls to protect the different kinds of data that they collect. One thing we have to understand is that laws are not optional. You have to follow them. Organizations often don't do that great a job in protecting PII, or personally identifiable information. Sometimes they lose the data. Sometimes they get hit by a data breach. When organizations don't voluntarily protect PII, governments create laws that force them to do that. Once the laws are enacted, these organizations must follow them. That is called compliance. Here are some of the things that you have to protect, ranging from an employee's first, middle, and last name, their home mailing address, all the way down to different authentication credentials. Organizations must follow laws and regulations, interpret them so that the policies and procedures can be defined. They must document policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. Compliance not only includes the state of being compliant, it also includes the steps and processes taken to become compliant. Compliance usually asks the questions, what are the rules and how must the rules be followed? The United States doesn't have one comprehensive data protection law. Instead, it has many laws that focus on different types of data found in different industries. These laws contain privacy and information security concepts and requirements. They also focus on how data can be used and how it must be protected. As an information security professional, you must be familiar with the compliance laws that impact your organization. Your job is not to understand the legal implications of the law, but rather know how that law impacts your organization and what you must do from an IT security perspective. If you are under a compliance law, you should do the following. Review the compliance law and its requirements. Assign a designated compliance officer or individual responsible and accountable for your organization's compliance. Create policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines to comply with legal and regulatory requirements. Identify your organization's gaps in compliance and prioritize the gap remediation. Implement proper security controls and countermeasures throughout your IT infrastructure in support of the compliance law's requirements. And create and deliver annual security awareness training that educates employees about the organization's legal requirements for compliance. How are privacy and information security related? Privacy is a person's right to control the use and disclosure of his or her own personal information. Control is a person can decide how his or her data can be collected, used, and shared with third parties. Information security is the process used to keep data private. Security is the process, privacy is a result. Let's talk about federal information security. The federal government is the largest creator and user of information in the United States. Government IT systems hold data that are critical for government operations, data that are important for running the business of the federal government, and sensitive military data. The Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA, of 2002 applies to federal agencies and their IT systems. Federal agencies fall under the executive branch of the United States government. The Office of Management and Budget is responsible for FISMA compliance. Its purpose and main requirements. FISMA requires each federal agency to create an agency-wide information security program that includes risk assessments. Agencies must perform risk assessments. They must measure the harm that could result from unauthorized access to or use of their IT systems. Agencies must base their information security programs on the results of these risk assessments. Annual inventory. Agencies must inventory their IT systems. They must update their inventory each year. Policies and procedures. Agencies must create policies and procedures to reduce risk to an acceptable level. The policies must protect IT systems throughout their life cycle. Agencies also must create configuration management policies. Subordinate plans. Agencies must make sure they have plans for securing networks, facilities, and systems or groups of IT systems. These plans are for technologies or system components that are a part of the larger information security program. Security awareness training. Agencies must give training to employees and any other users of their IT systems, including contractors. This training must make people aware of risks to the agency's IT systems. It also must make them aware of their duties to protect these systems. Testing and evaluation. Agencies must test their security controls at least once a year. They must test management, operational, and technical controls for each IT system. Remedial actions. Agencies must have a plan to fix weaknesses in their information security programs. Incident response. Agencies must have an incident response procedure. They must state how the agency detects and resolves incidents. Agencies also must report incidents to the Department of Homeland Security, which is DHS. And lastly, continuity of operations. Agencies must have business continuity plans as part of their information security programs. Now, again, this relates to government agencies, but you can see from what is required that these points would be very valuable to any private organization that needed to employ their own or develop and deploy their own information security system. An agency must protect the IT systems that support its operations, test its IT systems at least yearly, review the information security controls on IT systems, apply some types of controls and make sure they work, and monitor its security risk. FISMA has a Modernization Act of 2014, which clearly defines the roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, requirements, and practices needed to fully implement FISMA's security controls and requirements. A side-by-side comparison of the 2002 and 2014 legislation, DHS was anointed as the governing organization that is responsible for ensuring FISMA 2014 compliance, along with the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget. Reporting requirements for U.S. federal government agencies were defined in the 2014 version of the Act. New guidance and reporting requirements for security incidents were announced, and policies and guidelines were detailed for data breach notification compliance. The role of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, creates guidance that all federal agencies use for their information and security programs, creates standards that agencies use to classify their data and IT systems. creates guidance and minimum information security controls for IT systems, and creates Federal Information Processing Standard known as FIPS and Special Publications SPs. I think I mentioned this before, but you could develop your own um, information security program in a private business just by using the SPs that are provided by NIST. They don't just relate to, while they are primarily directed towards government agencies, um, they can be applicable to private businesses. Risk Management Framework Process. NIST recommends using a Risk Management Framework RMF approach for FISMA compliance. The NIST RMF outlines 6 steps that protect federal IT systems. These are: first, to categorize information systems. An agency must sort its IT systems based on risk. 2, select the minimum security controls. An agency must select controls for its IT systems based on their risk category. 3, implement security controls in IT systems. An agency must apply controls in certain areas that are specified by NIST. Included in these areas are access control, contingency planning, and incident response. Then you must assess security controls for effectiveness. An agency must assess its controls on a continuous basis to make sure they're effective in reducing risk. An agency must authorize the IT systems for processing. An agency must test its IT systems and approve their operation. An agency specifically must accept the risks of operation prior to allowing a system to operate. This process used to be known in FISMA terminology as certification and accreditation. And finally, an agency must continuously monitor security controls. They must monitor their security controls to make sure they're effective. They also must document any changes to their IT systems. They must assess changes for new risks. National Security Systems, or NSSS. These use a risk-based approach. These include systems used for intelligence activities, national defense, foreign policy, and military activities. The Committee on National Security Systems, or CNSS, oversees FISMA activities, and they use the same 6-step process as the NIST RMF. So some laws. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Its purpose and scope contains data protection rules that address security and privacy of personally identifiable health information. The Department of Health and Human Services responsible for rules and compliance. Protected health information, or PHI, is any individually identifiable information about a person's health, and it covers healthcare providers and business associates. HIPAA discusses what is known as a covered entity. This refers to very specific types of entities that must follow HIPAA. These include health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, any healthcare provider that transmits PHI in an electronic form. Determining which entities are covered under HIPAA can be complicated. Generally speaking, HIPAA covers most healthcare providers. Health and Human Services provides tools to help entities determine whether they're covered by HIPAA. HIPAA also applies to business associates of covered entities. A business associate is an organization that performs a healthcare activity for a covered entity. Covered entities may outsource some functions, such as claims and billing, to these organizations. They must comply with HIPAA. The main requirements of the HIPAA privacy rule. These determine how covered entities must protect the privacy of PHI. Covered entities may not use or disclose a person's PHI without his or her written consent. Exceptions allow a covered entity to share a person's PHI without a person's written consent. A covered entity must inform people about how it uses and discloses PHI. Even if a covered entity is allowed to use or disclose PHI without written consent, it must meet what is known as the minimum necessary rule. A covered entity may disclose the amount of PHI necessary to satisfy the reason why the information is being used or disclosed, but no more. Both covered entities and business associates must follow the breach notification rules. If a covered entity has a breach of unsecured PHI, it must notify the victims within 60 days of the discovery. A breach is discovered on the first day that the covered entity knows about it. Individuals must be notified without unreasonable delay. A covered entity may delay notification if a law enforcement official requests it. Under breach notification rules, business associates are also required to notify covered entities following their discovery of a breach of unsecured PHI. The main requirements of the HIPAA security rule. They require covered entities to use security safeguards to protect electronic protected health information, or EPHI. Require covered entities to create an information security program. Require covered entities to use information security principles to protect EPHI. And use required and addressable safeguards. The security rule doesn't require entities to have to use any specific type of security technology. However, to create its security program, an entity must consider its size and complexity, its technical infrastructure, hardware, software, and security resources, the cost of security measures, and the potential risks to EPHI. Here are some of the security rule administrative safeguards. For example, security management process, required specifications are risk analysis, risk management, sanction policy, information security activity review. Another one, EPHI access management, isolating healthcare clearinghouse function. The addressable specifications are access authorization and access establishment and modification. So I'll leave this up here for a few more seconds so you can review it. It's also in our textbook in chapter 15. Okay, here are the security rule physical safeguards. And the security rule technical safeguards. A good example in access control, the required specifications, unique user identification, emergency access procedure, and the addressable specifications are automatic log off and encryption and decryption. HIPAA oversight. Health and Human Services oversees compliance with the HIPAA privacy and security rules. Health and Human Services delegated this function to the Office for Civil Rights, OCR. They enforce the HIPAA compliance. The HITECH Act defined a tiered system for addressing the level of each HIPAA violation, tiers A through D. Tier A represents violations for which the offender didn't realize that he or she violated the act and would have handled the matter differently if he or she had. This results in a $100 fine for each violation, and the total imposed for such violations cannot exceed $25,000 for the calendar year. Tier B, these are for violations due to reasonable cause but not willful neglect. The result is a $1,000 fine for each violation. The fines cannot exceed $100,000 for the calendar year. Tier C, these are violations due to willful neglect that the organization ultimately corrected. The result is a $10,000 fine for each violation, and the fines cannot exceed $250,000 for the calendar year. Tier D, these are for violations of willful neglect that the organization did not correct. The result is a $50,000 fine for each violation, and the fines cannot exceed $1.5 million for the calendar year. The HIPAA Omnibus Regulations. Omnibus Rule provided a catch-all update to HIPAA and HITECH Act rulings and tighten the requirements of the covered entities and business associates. is modification to the standard for reporting breaches of unsecured PHI, an extension of Health and Human Services enforcement authority over business associates, expansion of the definition of the term business associate to include health information organizations, e-prescribing gateways, entities that provide data transmission services for PHI, and that require routine access to such PHI and personal health record vendors. Modifications to the requirements for business associate agreements. New obligations for business associates to enter into business associate agreements. Removal of limitations on the liability of covered entities for the acts and omissions of business associates. Changes to the requirements for notices of privacy practices. New limitations on the sale of PHI. New limitations on and clarifications concerning the use and disclosure of PHI for marketing. Relaxation of certain limitations on the use of PHI for fundraising. An improvement to the regulations concerning authorizations for the use or disclosure of PHI for research. This is the end of Part 1. Part 2 will cover the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, FERPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act, CIPA, and the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, which is not a legal act, but is an industry standard.